This is Brandy Rose Smith live from the Forbidden Library, and today we're gonna do some reading. Welcome in my nice new reading room that we've only used once so far. Yay! It's pretty and it's warm. Look at that fire going. Toasty. Special hello to Rohel of the future who will be watching the VOD. I hope you've had a wonderful day. So we'll be reading Misperception, which we are 52% of the way through, which is impressive. A lot of the other books we've been reading so far, we've gotten through a bit quicker, but this one's got us stuck, which is great. I like some content, sweet content, and it's been very fun, sweet content. Let me tell you about what's happened in the book so far to get you caught up. So, not putting any of our expectations on this book whatsoever. I will not describe this with my perception. I will describe just what happened in the book. So what happened in the book was, we have a character called Felix who has been imprisoned for as long as he can remember. And the only things he's interacted with while he's there are the tormentors. Two big tormentors and a little tormentor that open his cage, give him food, pick him up, and torment him terribly. One day, the tormentors put him in what he can only assume is a transport vessel that is put into another spaceship. And he goes to what he thinks is the mothership of these tormentors because he sees even more. And he hears screams that he understands. The first time he understands any language, because he doesn't understand the language of the tormentors. And they seem to be screaming for help. But they knock him out. And when he wakes up, they're operating on him, but then he kind of blacks out again. So when he wakes up back home in his cage, he realizes something's not right. He's been surgeryed on. Something's missing. He doesn't know what. And in his cage, there are claw marks of like something else has been there before. And those I say claw marks, nail marks is what he says. Nail marks. And his nails fit in there, so there was obviously someone there beforehand. And he starts to wonder, okay, what was here beforehand and what happened to them? He comes to the conclusion that the tormentors will eventually eat him and they've taken a part of him just to sample or something along those lines. And becomes very, very determined to escape. He successfully escapes his prison out into the wide world, out of not only his cage, but out the big prison door, into the wide world, gets into a grassy area. Something on four legs attacks him. He gets away, manages to he basically falls into a bush and manages to hide there. He gets to what could be described as a city. It's got big buildings, it's got walls of glass and mirrors and things that he describes, and rustling in a bin, in the trash, is something that looks like him. And it's the first person he's ever met that looks like him, and he's like, oh wow. And that person was called Fang, and that person takes them to their colony leader, who turns out this colony is a bit like a mafia, and he demands 3 great fowl be got for the leader, or he won't let him into the colony. And so poor Felix has no idea what a great fowl is in the first place, so he's no idea what he's being asked for. He goes away, he tries to find some help. He finds an older whatever he is called Riley, and Riley has been planning to escape the mobs for a while. So with that knowledge, Felix very quickly blackmails Riley into taking him with him, and eventually the two of them escape. It was a close call. The big leader, mobster Nikolai, did catch wind and did try to stop them, but they managed to get away. So the two of them travelled out of the city through a forest where Felix realised he's terrible at hunting, and Riley had to do all the hunting, and Riley has to look after him and answer all his questions, and he's really, really annoyed because he won't shut up. Until the two of them eventually get to another town. It's a bit smaller than the city. In the city, they find these monsters, these big metal monsters on wheels, and it's terrible. They're totally on cars. No, my perception is not it. No. So there's these big monsters, so they run away from the monsters, and they climb up this scaffolding where a monster with a metal arm is also trying to catch them. That metal arm is suspiciously like a net, and he's suspiciously like animal control or something. And they have a lot of panics. They get to the top of the tower, and lo and behold, Nikolai and his gang have found them too. And that's basically where we left off last time. It was a terrible cliffhanger, not pun intended, because they weren't hanging on the cliff, they were just on the cliff. So we'll find out if they hang in this chapter, chapter 14. A familiar foe returns. Let's get to it. Riley placed a protective arm in front of Felix as their foes inched closer. Nikolai, Riley began indignantly. You followed us this far. The light rain that had been coming down in drips had become a monsoon around them, and the droplets pattered off the scaffolding like rapid fire. Nikolai peered his massive head over the top of the roof above them, with a villainous grin spread across his face. I just missed you guys so much, he said. I couldn't live without you. Riley gritted his teeth. What now? He called up to him. Hopping down from the roof, Nikolai landed on the scaffolding right in front of them. Damien and Fang inched closer still, as Felix tucked himself closer behind Riley. Nikolai shrugged his shoulders. Now, he began casually, you die. Riley counted every step that Nikolai took towards them with a step back, shielding Felix behind him as he did. They crept backwards until Felix could feel nothing beneath his heels at the edge of the scaffolding. He turned and looked down. It was a very long way to the bottom, and for some reason, he couldn't stop imagining the splatting sound his head would make if it hit the ground from this height. Why couldn't you just let us go? Riley asked. I could never let you go, and you know that, Riley. Nikolai said. It's nothing personal, but allowing you to leave would set a dangerous precedent. If I let you leave, then everyone in the colony will think they can leave too. You see my conundrum now, little Felix? Felix buried his face behind Riley, but Nikolai's gaze lingered on him for a burning moment. It was as if Nikolai was on the verge of remembering something, but it had eluded him once again. He let it slip away once more and focused his attention on what was in front of him. Retribution on the two travelers for their desertion. You're insane! Riley cried out. Nikolai laughed heartily at Riley's outburst. On the contrary, my friend, he said, I am the sanest one here. I have cornered the resource market. Everyone brings their food straight to me. I've secured my own survival in the face of certain destruction. Don't you see how beautiful that is? Everyone can leave. If everyone can leave, then what do I have left myself? Why, I'd have to fend for myself. Nikolai took another step forward and then feigned a lunge. Startled, Riley flinched and took a step back, nearly pushing Felix off the ledge. He quickly reached back and secured Felix, and then joined him right on the edge of the scaffolding. Nikolai let out another hearty laugh. Anyone that's ever said you shouldn't play with your food is missing out, he said. You think you're the sanest one here? Riley scoffed. Nikolai turned his head to each of his henchmen. Fang was licking his lips, and Damien was mumbling to himself while twitching uncontrollably. Especially at the present time, yes, Nikolai said, following up with a heavy boom of laughter. My associates here are just waiting for my signal. Then it's night-night forever for the two of you. I've seen what they can do when they're hungry. Boy, are we famished from the trip you two have led us on. Nikolai flashed his enormous set of teeth. Riley inched back, once more ever so slightly, pushing Felix with him so that their heels were both hanging off the edge of the scaffolding together. Quickly glancing behind them, down at the ground, Riley noticed just how high up they actually were. Nikolai and the others continued to close in around them until Felix and Riley were nearly face to face with Nikolai's teeth. I wonder how you taste, Nikolai said menacingly. He slowly extended his teeth out to them when Felix felt Riley grab him by the hand and then launch himself backwards off the edge of the scaffolding, catapulting them both into a free fall. As they fell, they were completely horizontal, looking straight up at the sky as the heavy raindrops pelted off them, scattered with the falling soot. They watched Nikolai lean over the edge of the scaffolding, grinning deviously. Although he'd missed the opportunity at a meal, for now, by the time they were splattered on the ground, Felix was sure that he'd be there to take full advantage. As they plunged to their almost certain demise, Riley's grip tightened on Felix's hand. A strange wave of serenity washed over him, with Riley beside him. He was just as he was accepting his fate, Felix was jerked to a halt and swung violently to one side. He nearly smacked against the side of the brick building that the scaffolding was attached to, before he began swaying back and forth in the opposite direction. There is no fourth, I added that. Just swung back. Sorry. It's been a long day. I might make some extra mistakes today. Apologies in advance. When he looked up, Felix saw that Riley had reached out and grabbed the edge of the second level of scaffolding and was holding on for dear life. Flinging Felix up over the edge, Riley wriggled himself to safety next to him. "Run!" he shouted. Riley took off first, heading down the stairs from the second level of the scaffolding onto the first, and then finally back onto the ground. Fortunately, the metal arm was nowhere to be found, but the monsters were still circling down below, and they began roaring hungrily once again. Dashing fiercely by them, Riley and Felix kicked up the ash that blackened the ground behind them and dodged from side to side as the creatures tried to rip them apart. Moving like the wind, Riley zigzagged between the monsters as Felix struggled to keep up. "We're almost there!" Riley shouted back encouragingly. There was a sea of creatures that seemed to be coming at them from every direction. Riley suddenly disappeared behind one of them as it rushed between him and Felix, separating them. As Felix skidded to a stop, just narrowly avoiding the monster's pathway. "Riley!" Felix cried out, but his cries were drowned out by the rumbling roars of the monsters around them. He doubled back around, but found himself right in the path of another oncoming monster. Its mouth was open wide to swallow him. Felix dove quickly out the way. The monster's mouth clipped the back of his leg on the way by, which spun Felix around and completely disorientated him, when he landed on the ground, but didn't catch him enough to cause any real damage. Sitting up quickly, he saw another bearing down on him to finish him off. Felix dug his hands into the ground and rolled over, narrowly avoiding this one as well. He pushed himself up and continued running, but nearly slipped on wet, soot-coated pavement beneath him. There was seemingly no end to the monsters. Every time Felix dodged one by the skin of his teeth, 3 more were waiting in the wings for their turn at him. They had him completely surrounded. Riley was still nowhere to be seen. Completely on his own, Felix felt a sinking feeling of hopelessness begin to set in. A strange thought occurred to him, all at once, that he should never have come here. The world beyond the prison walls was no place for someone like him. He narrowly dodged another monster, when he suddenly caught sight of Riley's flaming red hair in his peripheral vision. Riley was just a few feet in front of him, but he was laying there on the pavement, motionless. Oh no! No. Bad book. Bad. Felix ran up to him. Riley! He cried. In the midst of the circling monsters, he finally reached him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Felix! Riley began weakly. They got me leg. He motioned down. Felix could barely even recognize what he saw as a leg at all. The monsters had their appetizer, and Felix was sure they'd do everything they could now to gorge themselves on the main course. Glancing around for a way out, Felix saw the bulging eyes of the monsters burning straight towards them. Quickly scanning the rest of his surroundings, he noticed a narrow alley between two of the outer reaches' towering buildings, not much farther in front of them. Just leave me, Felix, Riley said. Felix glanced down at his fallen companion, the same one that had saved him twice despite the risk to himself, and he knew that he wasn't about to do that. Grabbing Riley's arm, he flung it around his neck. Riley grimaced in pain as Felix hoisted his limp body up and then dove out of the way just in the nick of time. The monster swung right past them and then cried out with an ear-piercing screech as it slowed. Felix feared that it was trying to turn around for a second, run at them. He hoisted Riley up again and moved forward as quickly as he could. Riley was a bit heavier than Felix, so he was difficult. Riley was a bit heavier than Felix, so he was difficult to carry, but Felix managed to drag him to safety into the dark, narrow alleyways. The monsters circled as Felix dragged his companion further and further away from them. Fortunately, the alleyway was too narrow for the monsters to squeeze through, and none of them even tried. With the immediate threat behind them, Felix set Riley down and leaned him up against the alleyway wall. Riley was groaning in pain as Felix was trying to catch his breath. When Felix peered down the alley, the scaffolding was still within sight. Nikolai and his henchmen had watched everything and were now scurrying down, presumably after them. We can't rest here, Felix said and flung Riley's arm around his neck. They're coming after us. Leroy! Jenkins, can't help it. Riley groaned. Just leave me here. Felix wasn't hearing it. Hoisting Riley up, he dragged him through the alleyway until they finally emerged on the other side. There, propped up along the side of one of the buildings, he found a dumpster. The roof of the dumpster was closed, and Felix feared that he wouldn't be able to muster the strength to open it. Fortunately, on the other side of the dumpster was a sliding door that was left open, and he was able to scoot Riley up to it and push him inside. Felix gave one last look to make sure they hadn't been seen, and then he leapt into the dumpster and closed the sliding door behind them. Leroy, Riley moaned. It's not safe out there. You can't be out in the open like that. He had become completely delirious from trauma. Felix shushed him and listened outside. He couldn't hear Nikolai or the others, and the rumbling roars of the monsters had faded into the distance. Riley mumbled on for another moment, but trailed off before finally quietening. Felix at first feared that he might have died, but Riley's rhythmic breathing somewhat reassured him in the darkness that he had simply fallen asleep. Still, as Felix rested beside him, panting heavily as he listened to the raindrops beating down on the dumpster's roof, he wondered what the heck he was going to do next. it was inevitable that Riley was gonna get hurt. Really, it was. He had so many death flags going on, but no, this doesn't mean I want it to happen. How mean. How mean. We continue. Wait, I need to update my currently reading. Oh, hey Q, I'm really sorry. I know you liked Riley a lot. Currently reading chapter 15. I mean, at least he's not dead. Yet. It's not good, bro. Not good at all. I'll do my best. I mean, he can't die yet because he hasn't told us about Leroy yet. Therefore, he's at least immortal until that happens. Let's continue. Yeah, you keep telling yourself that. I'm sure if you can manifest the ending you wish where Riley and Felix get to live happily ever after in paradise. Or the promised land, that's where they're going, the promised land. Let's go. Let's find out. Riley slept for hours as Felix lay trembling beside him, unsure if his companion would even be the same again. The stench of the garbage around them was almost overwhelming. But Felix didn't dare leave the confines of the dumpster, especially alone. When Riley finally came to, he regained some grasp of reality. What happened? Riley groaned groggily. Trying to sit up, he winced in pain and grabbed his wounded leg. Am I dead? Thankfully not, no. He asked. You're not dead, Felix answered between sniffles. His voice startled Riley in the darkness. Riley didn't know where he was. Felix? Felix! Yeah, it's me, Felix answered. Felix, what happened? Riley asked. What happened to my leg? I can't feel it. I can't feel my leg, Felix! Panic rised with every word. Felix didn't know how to answer him. Riley's leg was a mangled wreck. In the darkness of the dumpster, the shape of it barely even resembled a leg anymore. Nikolai, Riley remembered. I can't believe that psycho followed us all the way here. Well, actually, I can believe it, because he's a psycho, but still! That's the kind of thing I would say. It's like, well, I can't believe it because of this, but still! He tried to stand up again, but cried out in pain and fell back once more. Felix, he continued, my leg! There's something wrong with my leg. I can't remember Nikolai and then the monsters and then... He was growing frantic again, but suddenly went quiet. Oh, Felix. They got me, didn't they? I really am dead, aren't I? No, Felix answered quietly. We're not dead, but they got you, Riley. Your leg, it's... My leg is what? Felix stared at the shadowy, disfigured outline of Riley's leg. I'm not sure, Felix admitted. What time is it? Riley asked frantically. Almost night. Where are we? The outer reach, Felix reminded him. Found a dumpster, but had to carry you. You carried me out of there? Riley asked. I couldn't leave you, Felix said. You could have gotten yourself killed doing that, Riley cried, suddenly very upset with Felix. I'm not responsible for you. I told you that before. I'm not responsible if you die. Well, I am responsible if you die, Felix fired back. Riley went quiet. Although he kept insisting that he wasn't responsible for Felix, he'd still come back for him twice. So Felix knew that Riley did feel a responsibility to protect him, regardless of how much he'd tried to deny it. Likewise, Felix felt responsible for him. After all, they'd been through so much together, and that's what a true friend would do for another. "We shouldn't stay here," Riley said. "When night falls, we should keep going." "But Riley," Felix began, "your leg." "I'll be fine," Riley snapped back. Felix wasn't so sure, but he decided that he'd carry his friend if needed to, and he didn't take offense to Riley snapping at him. Being responsible for himself and someone as helpless as Felix probably made Riley feel a tremendous amount of pressure. Now, with his leg injury, Felix could tell that Riley wasn't sure if he'd be able to follow through on what he'd set out to do. He was probably already beginning to feel like a failure. Like he'd let himself down. But not only that, like he'd let Felix down. Meanwhile, Riley felt guilty for snapping at Felix. "Aw, sweetie, it's okay. You've been through a lot. You can snap at people. You have a whole pass for snapping at people." He was just a kid, and all he was looking for was someone that could help him, someone that could be a friend to him. Riley hadn't been that. In fact, he'd been quite cruel to him. Still, he couldn't allow himself to get too close. That was when someone always ended up getting hurt. Too late! "Do you think they're still looking for us?" Riley asked. "Who?" Riley snorted a chuckle. There were so many things after them that it was almost laughable. "Any of them!" Riley scoffed. "I don't think so," Felix answered as the rain continued to pelt off the roof of the dumpster. It would have been almost peaceful if it hadn't been for the countless horrors waiting for them just outside. "How much do you think they're worth?" Riley asked abruptly. "What do you mean?" Felix asked. "Your bounty!" Riley reminded him. "How much do you think your tormentors are willing to pay to get you back?" Felix thought about it for a moment and chuckled to himself. "I can't imagine very much," he admitted. "I mean, I can't hunt, I ask far too many questions, and I cry all the time." Sweet. At least he knows. He's aware. Riley chuckled. "Not to mention how scrawny you are," he said. "You've got no meat on your bones. You couldn't possibly taste very good. I don't see why everyone's clamoring to eat you. And also, you smell like garbage." Felix laughed. "What do you think you smell like right now?" he asked. "That's besides the point," Riley continued. "But I'd agree you probably aren't worth that much. I don't even know why anyone would want to find you. As a matter of fact, I did find you, and I'm strongly considering putting out a reward for somebody else to take you." Felix started laughing uncontrollably, and Riley joined in. Of course, his words were mean-spirited, but Felix didn't take any offense. They were in dire straits at the moment, and the laughter helped to relieve some of the nervous tension that had reached its breaking point. The laughter eventually subsided and left them in silence once more. "Riley," Felix began again, "can you tell me about the Promised Land?" It felt almost as if Felix was asking Riley to tell him a bedtime story, but Riley reminded himself that he wasn't his babysitter. Yet, he decided to indulge him nonetheless. They could both use a fairy tale, especially now when all hope was beginning to feel lost. Closing his eyes, he tried to imagine the place that he'd dreamed about countless times before. "There's plenty of food to go around," he began. "Good food, too. And everyone gets their fair share. Nobody will take anything from you, or enforce any unfair rules. There's no quotas. And it never rains. It's paradise." "Paradise?" Felix repeated. Following Riley's lead, he closed his eyes as well. When he did, in his mind's eye, he could almost see the place that Riley described. the place where the ocean met the sand. That's right, Felix said. They used to talk about it all the time back in the colony. Had any of them been there before? Some of them attempted to make the trip, Riley said. Attempted? I'm not sure if they ever made it, Riley admitted. But some of our kind insisted they knew that some knew of some that had. If they really did make it, I can't imagine they'd come back to the colony to tell us about it anyway. They'd be giving up paradise to run into hell on Earth. Why are things so bad at the colony? Felix asked. Why hasn't anyone tried to do anything to stop Nikolai? It's not that easy, Riley said. He rules with an iron fist. Everyone in the colony is terrified of him, or of what he'd do to them. What would he do to them? Felix asked. Would he really eat members of his own kind? Riley was silent. He's done some bad things, he finally admitted. And he's made those who work for him do unspeakable things as well. I wouldn't rule cannibalism out of his laundry list of misdeeds. Nikolai's a bad, bad man. And Riley's voice makes my throat bad, bad too. Nothing some water can't fix. And he's after us, Felix added. Riley was gravely silent again before continuing. Things didn't always used to be the way they are, though, he said. What do you mean? Felix asked. Long before I was born, and even before the others, the colony was thriving. But the others are humans, so how long ago was this? Riley said. After the others arrived, our kind was able to live in harmony with them for a time, but gradually they began expanding their own colonies, tearing down the forests to build their cities, towering civilizations that touch the sky, and chasing all the food away. Towering civilizations? Felix repeated. That's right, Riley replied. Like Metropolis and the Outer Reach. And I'm sure many others. Wait a minute, Felix said. I thought Metropolis was the colony. Riley shook his head. The colony exists in the shadow of Metropolis, Riley said. A colony of others. That explained why when Felix had been That explained why when Felix had been mesmerized by the place and had asked Fang if their kind had created all of this, Fang had scoffed at him and assumed that he must have been joking. The massive buildings and the alleyways that they traversed in Metropolis, here in the Outer Reach and even in Felix's dreams, formed by the skeletons of civilizations constructed by the others, or tormentors, or whatever. Members of the colonies soon became splintered, Riley continued. Some decided to willingly enslave themselves to the others, while some tried to survive despite them. Did you ever stop to ask yourself why you were imprisoned, Felix? Come to think of it, he never did. Spends his whole life in captivity and never ponders why. Until he gets taken to the totally not vet. Oh, Felix. Oh, Felix. You are a simple, simple boy. It wasn't like he could remember doing anything wrong that would warrant his imprisonment. He flashed back again to his dreams. His mother abandoned him in the alleyway of a tormentor city, and then he saw the creature he now knew as the metal arm standing over him. Then everything went black. Somewhere deep within his dreams lied the answer to everything. But no matter how much he tried to focus on it, he couldn't quite reach it. It's because, Riley continued, somewhere along the line, The others started abducting and enslaving members of our kind against their will. Felix shuddered. Another memory flashed before him. He was back in the alleyway after his mother had abandoned him. The metal arm bent down in front of him and scooped little Felix up in his arms. The memories stopped there, and Felix was ripped back to reality. However, even for a time after, Riley continued, those that struggled to survive despite the others were able to endure, but food was becoming more and more scarce. That's when some started to head for the Promised Land. Before long, the leader of the colony at the time made the decision that the rest of us would begin making preparations so that we could all travel to the Promised Land. But things went awry. Shortly after, Nikolai rose to power in the midst of the turmoil and everything changed. The Promised Land was never spoken of again after that, except in secret. Felix was trying to absorb all the information that Riley had just given him, but was also trying to uncover the secrets hidden deep within his own subconscious memories. Somehow, Riley seemed to like the key to it all. Riley seemed like the key to it all. He seemed to know about Felix's origins in the prison, even more than Felix himself. Undoubtedly, it all meant that Felix had a life before, which was so long ago that he was struggling to remember. He had been free and enslaved in the prison against his will? Maybe the reason they tormented him so much was to keep him subservient to them until they were ready to eat him. Maybe that was his place on the food chain, and by escaping he disrupted the balance. Riley tried to sit up again, grunting in pain, but was finally able to do so. The storm outside was gradually subsiding as they sat silently together in the dumpster. Now that Felix knew the Outer Reach and Metropolis were creations of the tormentors, sitting in a pile of garbage, he thought about how the vile beasts sure did produce an obscene amount of waste. He began to wonder if the alien creatures had simply trashed their home planet, expending all of its resources, and decided to colonize this one. "We should get going," Riley finally said as the rain began to cease altogether. "But Riley," Felix said again. Tried again. Shifting around, Riley hoisted himself up on his good leg. He was able to stand and hobbled around a bit without the use of his injured, mangled one. "I was twice as fast as you before," Riley said, "so now we'll be even." That's why Riley is a good character. Felix chuckled. "Alright," Riley said. "Now help me out of here." Felix slid open the side door of the dumpster and peered out. Night had fallen, and outside, amongst the tormentors' towering buildings in the alleyway, they were completely alone. In the stillness, with soot falling gently from the sky, and smokestacks silently billowing their smog, the place seemed almost serene. Felix hopped out of the dumpster and turned to help Riley down. Yeah, that's why I'm... All the descriptions point to them being human if you're taking the descriptions at face value. That's why I think trash pandas, if they're not humans, is the best comparison, because I mean, I don't know. I'm thinking about Rocket and the fact that he stands on two legs all the time, but for all we know, this could be I've been putting them as an animal and they could have been humans the whole time. We don't know. And I'm really hoping the book tells me at some point. "Easy does it," Riley said. When they were finally on the ground, he scanned their surroundings and then looked up at the night sky. Through the thick smog overhead, the guiding star was nowhere to be found. "What do we do?" Felix asked. Riley looked around. "Staying here isn't going to get us there," Riley said, so we pick a direction and go. Let's move. Felix didn't necessarily like the uncertainty of the plan, but he trusted Riley. Together, the two of them started walking. He let Riley hobble along in front of him, leading the way while he followed closely behind. Felix had never experienced the aftermath of a rainstorm before, or at least, not that he could remember. The rain had left standing puddles on the ground, and although he was on edge and sure Riley would mock him by calling him a child again, Felix couldn't help but splash in them a little, which he enjoyed very much, and actually helped calm his nerves. Riley knew what Felix was doing, but decided not to say anything. After everything they'd been through, he decided to let the boy keep some of his playful innocence. Aww, any good? Any good? After a while, although he was certain they were alone, Felix had the sneaking suspicion that they were being followed. I mean, they were definitely being followed. They walked aimlessly for a time through the steady industrial alleyways of the outer reach, and although Felix tried to fend away the feeling of helplessness, he began to fear that they were helplessly lost. Finally though, the travellers came upon a large, slow-moving stream of water that cut through the place. The water itself was murky with pollution, and along the bank there were sewage drains from the buildings across the way, dumping waste directly into it. Gross. The ocean? Felix asked hesitantly. This was the largest body of water he'd ever seen, but this didn't nearly meet up to his expectations of the paradise that Riley described, the place where the ocean met the sand. I don't think so, Riley answered with uncertainty. Not sure what this is. The Blackwater River. A mysterious voice called out to them, confirming Felix's worst fears that someone or something had been following them. Riley! Felix cried out and grabbed his friend by the arm. Shushing him, Riley whirled around quickly. The two of them stared into the dark abyss behind where the voice had come from, as it called to them from the darkness once more. A direct tributary to the ocean, the voice said, but not the ocean itself. Riley and Felix stared back through the void, but neither said a word. Riley, the voice called, closer than before. Is that you? Felix's first thought was that it was Nikolai, although when he came down from the initial scare, he realized that it was an unfamiliar voice, and spoken in a far less threatening tone than Nikolai or his henchmen. Riley was staring intently into the abyss. I thought it was you, the voice called cheerily. I'd recognize that flaming red hair of yours anywhere. Clarence! Clarence? What a name. I love the name Clarence. Riley called back in disbelief. Clarence? Felix repeated in confusion. Wait a minute. The same Clarence that insisted on thanking the great fowl for their sacrifice? Riley didn't answer as a figure emerged from the shadows behind them. He was one of their kind with long, dark hair that was streaked with silver from old age. Chatterance. Ah, yes. Chatterance who respects the circle of life. A rather large, overweight figure. He was somewhere between their size and Nikolai's, but much heftier. A wide grin was spread across his face. Is that little Leroy with you? Is that why Riley keeps mistaking Felix for Leroy? Oh no. Like, is Felix actually Leroy? It's Felix Jenkins. Clarence asked, squinting towards Felix and advancing towards them. Turning to Riley, Felix watched his whole demeanor suddenly shift from that of excited disbelief to cool indifference. No, Riley replied. This is Felix. You always did have a soft spot for the strays, Clarence said. You know, the real helpless ones. Hey! Felix cried, his face growing flush red with embarrassment. Nobody acknowledged him. Where's Leroy? Clarence asked. Riley was silent for a moment. He's gone, Clarence, he said. The grin faded from Clarence's face. Oh, I'm so sorry, Riley, he said. Riley shook his head and looked down at his feet. It doesn't matter, he replied. We've all lost someone close to us, Riley said. Clarence said. Riley glanced up suddenly. So, you know, he asked, surprised. I'm sorry, Clarence. He trailed off, unsure how to finish the final part of what it was he was trying to say. It's just not safe out there, he interrupted. You know that as well as I do. Riley nodded his head solemnly. I thought you were dead, he finally said. Felix was surprised by the abrupt change in his tone. You wouldn't be so lucky, Clarence cried with a hearty boom of laughter. Walking right past Felix, as if he wasn't even there, he put a big arm around Riley's neck. Clarence shook him and rubbed his flaming red hair into a frizzled mess. Lighting up a bit, Riley smiled. The last time I saw you, he started. I know, Clarence interrupted. It seems like the end, but I'm alive to tell you the tale. I was going to say that you were skinnier, Riley said. Clarence laughed and gave Riley a playful jab to his side. You look a little worse for wear yourself, my friend, Clarence said. What in the heck did you do to your leg? He asked, taking a step back and examining Riley from head to toe. Oh, nothing, Riley said, turning away to conceal his weakness from Clarence. Just a little accident. Some little accident, Clarence remarked. What brings you all the way out here anyway? You're a long way from home. We're going to the promised land, Riley said. Felix shot him a glance, a bit taken aback that Riley would reveal their secret so easily. Although these two seemed to go way back, if Riley could trust him, Felix figured that he could too. Did you ever make it there? Clarence nodded, after hesitating for just a moment. Even this brief, virtually undetectable hesitation struck Felix as rather odd. But you never came back to the colony, Riley replied, sounding completely betrayed. Clarence was quiet, as if he was planning his next words carefully before speaking again. I had every intention of doing so, he eventually said. But it's not that simple, Riley. Riley stared at him intently before finally breaking his stare. Is it everything they say it is? He asked optimistically. And more, Clarence told him, and then smacked his large, sagging belly. He glanced down at Riley's mangled leg again. But you've got a little way to go, friend, he said. Are you sure you can make it there, all there alone on that thing? Glancing down at his own leg for the first time, he seemed to recognize the significance of his injury. He's not alone, Felix piped in. He's got me. Clarence turned his attention to Felix. At first, it seemed like he had barely noticed Felix at all, but when he finally looked at him, the slightest hint of recognition crossed his face. It was as if it was the same look that Felix had seen in Nikolai a few times previously. However, just like those times, the look quickly faded. Still, Clarence's stare lingered, as if he was desperately trying to recapture that feeling. Felix couldn't help but notice there was something cold beneath his stare. like he was locked in a trance. But this quickly faded as well when Clarence smiled at him. Of course he does, Clarence said. Tell me, do I know you from somewhere? His cold stare made Felix uncomfortable, and he slunk away behind Riley without answering. How much further is it? Riley interrupted. It's at least a full day's journey, Clarence announced, finally looking away from Felix. Which way is it? Riley asked sheepishly, not wanting to admit out loud that they were, in fact, completely lost. All you have to do is follow the Blackwater River, Clarence said. Like I said before, it's a tributary to the ocean, meaning it feeds directly to it. If you follow it downstream, you'll eventually get there. He cut himself off abruptly, and Felix noticed Clarence's face suddenly brighten up, like he'd been struck with an idea. Tell you what, Clarence continued, I'm actually on my way back there right now. Why don't I just bring you there myself? Really? Riley cried excitedly, then cleared his throat and tried again. This time with his usual disinterestedness. I nailed pronouncing that, but I felt like I needed to try pronounce that again because that is a hell of a word. I mean, really. Anything for you, my old friend, Clarence said. When can we leave? Riley asked. Why waste any more time? Clarence said. We can leave right now. I'll get you there in no time, even in your current condition. I need a drink. Yeah, Clarence is definitely not to be trusted. Poor old Riley's gonna get potentially betrayed. Riley tried to conceal his leg again. Sounds like a plan, he said. All right then, Clarence agreed, nodded his head. This way, gentlemen. Before he turned to lead the way, he passed a glance over to Felix, and Felix could once again sense a coldness behind his stare. Finally, Clarence turned and began waddling off in front of them, following the backwater river downstream. I had a thought for a moment when he said waddling. I was like, what if they're birds? But then that doesn't make sense. They would have... You can't talk about hands or nails if you're a bird, so that's not a... That's not a clue. Riley hobbled after him, and Felix quickly caught up. Walking right next to Riley, he whispered in his ear, Penguins! I would love them to be penguins, but penguins don't have nails. Or claws or anything along those lines. But now this is very entertaining to imagine penguins. Kowalski. They have the right names. Boom. Boom. Riley hobbled after him, and Felix quickly caught up. Walking right next to Riley, he whispered in his ear. Are you sure about this? Felix asked, keeping a watchful eye on the back of Clarence's head. Don't you think it's kind of a strange coincidence that this guy shows up now, of all times? And don't you think that he's being just a little bit too helpful? Felix, Riley began softly in an almost comforting tone. Shouldn't you be a few feet behind me? But Riley, Felix began before Riley interrupted. I trust Clarence with my life, he said. He was like a father to me back at the colony. If he says that he'll get us there, I know that he'll deliver on that promise. Now, take a few steps back and try to keep your neuroses together. Maybe splashing in some more puddles or something. Felix searched Riley's eyes, but found that his companion was set on his decision. Nodding reluctantly in agreement, Felix let Riley hobble a couple of steps ahead of him as he found his own place in the line. Again, Felix thought thought that if Riley could trust Clarence, then he could trust him too. Still, something just didn't feel quite right. And it was, in fact, the end of the chapter. Chapter 16, we have a sus party member. Poor Riley. If Clarence really is sus... But then, Clarence might be only sus for Felix. He might, like, sneakily try to get rid of Felix while Riley's not looking and be like, oh no, the child died, oh no. Like that. Maybe. Letting sleeping beasts lie. Things have really gotten worse since you've been gone, Clarence, Riley said. Much worse. That's exactly what I feared, Clarence replied. I promise where I'm taking you, you'll never have to worry about that wretched colony ever again. Do you think, actually, better theory, Clarence has been adopted by some tormentors and is kind of free range and he's allowed to run around and do things, but he has to go back every so often. And now he wants Riley to get adopted by them too because he's quite happy and comfortable with it and he wants Riley to be happy and comfortable too. But Felix is a problem. Because they might take Riley in, but they might not take Felix in. Maybe. Let's go. The group of weary travellers crept along through the stillness of the outer reach. That was like a ghost town, especially at this hour of night. Following the twisted route of the Blackwater River, on the other side of them were the towering buildings of the Tormentor civilization. How did you manage to get away? Riley asked. Clarence began chuckling to himself, like the answer to that question was some sort of inside joke that only he was a part of. Now there's a story, he said. Strangely enough, that wasn't really an answer to Riley's question, but he let it go on for now. Felix could tell that Riley was getting exhausted from having to hobble along without use of one of his legs. The group stopped momentarily to rest. When they did, Clarence's looming shadow consumed Riley as he leant up against the brick wall and slumped to the ground. Felix watched helplessly. His friend's leg was so malformed that Felix feared he'd never be able to walk on it again. His attention shifted to Clarence, and he was surprised to see that Clarence was staring right back at him. I don't remember you from the colony, Clarence said. Once more, he seemed like he was trying to remember something that was right there, but he couldn't quite grasp it. Maybe I knew your parents. Felix doubted that, because even he didn't know his own parents, or, for that matter, even know who they were. That's the same thing. Because even he didn't know his parents, or for that matter, that makes sense. You said the same thing twice. Anyway, stop it. We're not editing. We're not editing! Turn off the author brain, let's go. All he knew of them was when he was very young, his mother abandoned him in a labyrinth of mirrors, surrounded by towering buildings. Oh, a minute. Wow. Not unlike where they found themselves now. He could hardly remember that life in his dreams. The only life he'd ever truly known was in the prison under the watchful eyes of the tormentors. I'm not from the colony, Felix muttered. Although Riley trusted him, Felix didn't want to give away too much information. Clarence grunted, but he continued eyeing Felix suspiciously. I can tell you're not from around here, he finally said. Yeah, Felix mumbled. 'Cause I'm not dirty enough. As if that was a bad thing. Clarence chuckled, but heartlessly. Is this your first time in the concrete jungle? He asked. The what? Don't mind him, Riley interrupted. He doesn't get out much. Felix shot Riley a dirty look, but Riley didn't look back up at him. He was busy tending to his wounded leg. We've got time for your story, Clarence, Riley continued. Like you said, we've got at least a full day's journey ahead of us. When we stop for the night, I'll tell you the story, Clarence said, finally breaking off his fruitless stare from Felix. But for now, we should get going. He glanced around the alleyway. Felix noticed he seemed on edge, almost like he was expecting something to happen. What's the matter, Clarence? Felix asked, somewhat accusingly. You look worried. Clarence looked back at him. The stars in the sky reflected the silver streaks of his hair, but when Felix stared into his eyes, they were cold and empty. There's a lot of dangerous things out here, Clarence cautioned. The tone in which he spoke was flat. There's a lot to be worried about. Before he finally broke off his stare again, Felix thought he detected a faint smile across his face. What's gonna happen? I'm scared. We should keep moving, Clarence repeated. All right, Riley mumbled as he rose from the ground. Just a little bit further, Clarence encouraged, smiling widely at his old friend. Then we can stop for the night. Before turning around, he gave Felix one more look, and when he did, his smile faded and his expression became eerily emotionless. Oh no, he has been brainwashed by the tormentors. Riley warned us about this, his friends coming back, but not quite being his friends. My eyebrows are going wild. I set up a new desk today. I have a shiny new desk, therefore my camera's not exactly in the same place, so I'm gonna have to figure that out. But for now, they're going wild. Yes. Clarence started walking again, following the Blackwater River downstream, and Riley took his lead. Riley, Felix whispered again, pleading with him. I don't know about this. Riley shushed him and waved him off. He seemed particularly agitated now. Felix fell back in line and followed quietly behind him. It didn't take long for Felix to notice how badly Riley was limping and worried about him continuing much further. Moreover, he decided he didn't trust Clarence, and he was worried about where he was leading them. A short while later, Felix couldn't handle his paranoia any longer, and he called out to the group. I think we should stop for the night, he tried. Riley was silent. We're almost there, Clarence repeated. He spoke indifferently, almost as if he were in some kind of trance. A cool wind had picked up and was whistling eerily, howling a high-pitched scream through the outer reach. Felix could feel his heart thumping in his chest. Something was definitely not right. When they finally reached the perimeter of the outer reach, the Blackwater River began to widen and the current picked up speed. The smog began to clear overhead as they left the outer reach behind, and they were once again able to pick up the trail of the guiding star. Felix breathed a sigh of relief when he saw it. Although he didn't trust Clarence, he was still leading them the right way. They continued on for a bit until the travellers came upon a tall wooden fence perched at the end of a cliff. The presence of such a purposeful construction seemed out of place here. But then again, nothing really made sense to Felix in the world beyond the prison walls. Not much made sense within them either, but that was a different issue entirely. The Blackwater River surrounded the fence on the other side, and then continued somewhere off into the distance. Felix lost sight of it in the dark. Clarence stopped just in front of the fence. It was dark beyond it, and Felix couldn't make out anything on the other side. This is the place, just up ahead, Clarence said. The Promised Land, Riley asked optimistically. Not yet, he told them, but a safe place to stay for the night. Felix tried to see over the fence, which loomed high over their heads, but it was still too tall and too dark to see anything beyond it. Where? Felix asked. Just through here, Clarence said, and pointed to a spot at the bottom of the fence that the dirt had been disturbed and slightly dug out. We're going under this? Felix asked nervously. What's on the other side? A safe place to stay for the night. A safe place to stay for the night, Riley interrupted irritably. Weren't you listening? Felix was taken aback by Riley's sudden outburst. Clarence nodded his head. We just have to crawl under the fence and keep walking, Clarence said. This place is just past this lot. Felix stared down at the dugout spot at the bottom of the fence. It seemed like a dark, foreboding tunnel that led to nowhere. At first he figured that the fence was meant to keep unwanted intruders out, but as he stared into the dark depths of the tunnel beneath the fence, a more terrifying thought occurred. Perhaps the fence wasn't meant to keep intruders out, but keep whatever was lurking in the darkness beyond it in. He looked back up at Clarence. Clarence was staring right back at him. Isn't there another way around? Felix pleaded, his voice cracked. Well, of course, Clarence said. There's always more than one way to skin a cat. A disturbing idiom, to be sure. But you want to cross the raging river to our left to go to the cliff on our right. But you want to cross the raging river to our left, or go to the cliff on our right. Felix glanced in both directions. Neither seemed particularly appealing, but then again, neither did the alternative. Still, Felix knew that they couldn't stay here, and he definitely didn't want to go back. The fence, he finally decided. Good, Clarence replied with a feigned smile. Because you're going first. Felix shot a glance over at Riley. What are you waiting for? Riley asked, annoyed. If Felix's eyes could talk, then they would have been screaming, Help me! Yet Riley didn't seem to get the message, or maybe he just didn't care. Felix turned back towards the fence. Why do I have to go first? He asked. You're the smallest, Clarence said. It'll be easier for you. Riley tried one last, desperate look at Riley, but Riley couldn't even look back at him. For a moment, Felix thought that he looked ashamed of something. All right, Felix finally decided, biting nervously at his lower lip. Dropping down to the ground in the front of the fence, he began to crawl under it. Making it through without much difficulty, he emerged on the other side, pushed himself up by his arms, but kept his head down. He was covered in dirt and started to brush himself off. Behind him, he could hear one of the others struggling their way under the fence, and he turned to look. In the moonlight, he could see the silver streaks of Clarence's hair as he squirmed his way under. When Felix turned back in front of him, he looked up. All of the hair on his body raised in terror. He opened his mouth to scream, but Clarence quickly threw a hand across Felix's mouth and squeezed tightly, muffling Felix's cries. Riley followed under the fence behind Clarence and stood beside him. Directly in front of all of them, no more than a few inches in front of Felix's face, was the horrifying, bulging eyes of a monster. When Felix looked around, he could see there were dozens of them, all lined up in a row like they were waiting to take their turn in line for a piece of him. Felix tried desperately to fight his way free from Clarence, but Clarence only embraced him tighter, lifting him off the ground. Felix's worst fears had been realized. He knew there was something off about Clarence the whole time, and he knew he couldn't be trusted. Now he knew why. Clarence had led them all right into a trap. Felix wasn't sure why he'd done it. Maybe as a sacrifice to the monsters to save himself, or maybe just to get Felix out of the picture. But either way, Clarence had done it. He'd led them right into the monster's lair. The more Felix fought and kicked, the harder Clarence squeezed him, and Felix was no match for his size. What was even stranger was that Riley seemed to be on Clarence's side. Instead of trying to help Felix escape, he was reaching over to silence him too. As Felix continued squirming with all his might, Felix began to fear that Riley and Clarence had made a pact this whole time. Riley had been planning on feeding Felix to the monsters to spare his own life. The whole time, when Felix had thought that Riley was finally opening up to him, and they were slowly becoming friends. Had all been a lie? What was even stranger still was that the monsters hadn't budged an inch towards them. Felix feared that they were patiently waiting for their meal to stop squirming, and the second that he did, they would devour him whole. He finally managed to break his mouth free from Clarence's grasp, but only for a moment. "It was a setup!" he cried before Clarence quickly muffled him once more. "Felix!" Riley replied harshly as he narrowly dodged the wild feet that were kicking unapologetically towards his head. "Felix! What the heck has gotten into you? Keep your voice down, or they're gonna kill us!" Clarence pinned Felix to the ground forcibly, and he finally stopped squirming. Panting heavily and exhausted from pointlessly struggling, Felix was no match for either of them. Standing over him, Clarence stared down at Felix menacingly. Felix became silent, waiting to meet his impending doom. "You'll wake them," Clarence said emotionlessly. Finally releasing his hand from Felix's mouth, he sat beside him on the ground, completely exhausted as well. Although he was much stronger than Felix, the little guy had still put up one heck of a fight. It almost reminded him of his own scrappiness back in the day. "Wake them?" Felix repeated between gasps for breath, as he sat up and stared down at the row of monsters. He realized all at once that the reason the monsters hadn't budged an inch towards them was not because they were waiting until Felix stopped squirming to devour him. It was because they were sleeping. Felix stared into the bulging eyes of the beast in front of him. They slept with their eyes open. But their eyes weren't as bright as they were when they were awake and hunting. The monsters slept in tight packs and were frighteningly silent sleepers, which made them all the more terrifying. The fence that surrounded this place seemed to block out all sound beyond it, creating a sort of vacuum within its limits, so that even the coursing river on the other side couldn't be heard, and this place was deathly quiet. Felix was petrified that even the slightest noise would wake the creatures. Fortunately, his outburst hadn't done so, but the next one might, and then there would be nowhere to run. Felix turned his attention next angrily towards Clarence, who had led them right into their clutches. He realized that Riley hadn't actually betrayed him, and Clarence hadn't brought him here to be sacrificed either, but he'd still led them right here, right into the monster's lair. All the same. Clarence was still struggling to catch his own breath. The years had taken away his stamina. "Don't want to stay here too long," he said. "They could wake at any moment." Riley nodded his head in agreement. Looking for a way around the pack of sleeping beasts, Felix couldn't see any. The line of them continued as far as his eyes could see in the darkness. "How do we get around them?" Felix whispered. "We don't," Clarence answered coldly. "We've got to sneak between them." He rose silently from the ground as Felix watched him in disbelief. "You must be out of your mind!" Felix whispered harshly. Shushing him, Riley glanced down nervously to make sure that they hadn't been heard. Fortunately, the monsters remained fast asleep. "Let's go," Clarence said. Grabbing Felix by the collar, he hoisted him off the ground and pushed him forward. Felix stumbled a couple of steps closer to the monsters, but he stopped and turned back. "Isn't there another way?" he begged. "The cliff or the raging river," Clarence repeated, pushing him forward again, knowing full well that Felix would choose neither. Felix crept quietly up the narrow gap between two of the monsters. They slept close together, and Felix feared that even if he shimmied between them and sucked in his stomach while holding his breath, he would be unable to squeeze through without making contact. He turned back once more. Clarence's looming figure was behind him, encouraging him forward. "What's the matter?" Clarence asked. "Don't you trust me? Don't trust you as far as I can throw you, and apparently you're quite fat, so I cannot throw you very far." Felix tried looking past him to Riley, who was still refusing to look back at him, then craned his neck and faced the monsters again, taking one last deep breath in. Hopefully, he thought, not the last one he would ever take. He began creeping forward between the sleeping beasts. As he moved, he tried to focus on the space beyond them, trying to block them out altogether. By doing this, he could almost pretend he was somewhere else, not sandwiched between two of the deadliest creatures he'd ever encountered. In front of him, he noticed the back ends of the two monsters he was in between seemed to converge at a point where they were almost touching. As he continued, the space between them was narrowing. Once the space had become too narrow, Felix slowed and turned himself to the side. Shuffling his feet from side to side, he inched forwards between them. While his body was turned so that it was now facing them, he tried desperately to keep his head facing the direction that he was moving, refusing to acknowledge the fact that he was no more than an inch away from contact. Further ahead, Felix had to suck in his stomach even more just to fit through. Closing his eyes tightly, he continued shuffling until suddenly he could feel their cold, sleek skin against his body. It took everything he had not to cry out. When he felt their skin up against him, the breath he'd been holding was forced out, causing him to exhale loudly. He froze. Not only was he now wedged between them, he was also paralyzed with fear. Clarence shoved him from behind. Shoved him from behind. "I'm stuck," Felix whispered. Sheer terror filled him. Clarence shoved him again, harder this time, and Felix squeaked against the monster, moving forward only an inch. Clarence shoved him forcefully for a final time, and Felix fell forward, squeaking through the monster and tumbling to the ground, free from the gap between them. Sitting up, Felix struggled to catch his breath. Behind him, Clarence squeezed through and Riley followed. Honestly, if Felix got stuck there, I'm surprised Clarence made it through. If Clarence is more chunky. Chunky. Again, if it is a trash panda, there's a chunky trash panda. It is a very cute image. Clarence grabbed Felix by the collar and pulled him up once again, as he and Riley brushed past their bewildered companion. Felix's eyes darted around his new surroundings. There was a swarm of monsters around them in every direction, and they were smack dab in the middle of them all. If they were going to wake up now, there was definitely nowhere to run, and certainly nowhere to hide. His eyes quickly found Riley, who was continuing forward after Clarence, but hobbling along worse than before. Obviously, Felix knew they weren't staying here. Obviously, Felix knew staying here wasn't an option. He had to follow. Slowly, he put one foot in front of the other, trying to simplify the rushing thoughts through in his head by repeating left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, under his... I nearly read that as under his brain. Yes, because that's how you think things. You think things under your brain. It's my brain today. My brain today. It's not... It is not Taicho. Under his breath. With Felix's gaze locked on the back of Riley's head, he wasn't really paying attention to where he was stepping. Without realizing it, he brought his foot down on something hard. He glanced down in horror, but it was too late to stop himself. His foot came down with his full weight on what he assumed in the darkness was a bone from a long since devoured meal. The bone itself wasn't necessarily what caused Felix such fright, although it was a bit unsettling, but it was the sound it made when it crunched under him, complying with a loud snap as it split in two. Riley and Clarence whipped around in horror. The snap of the bone echoed off the tremendous bodies of the beasts and the walls of the lair around them. When it finally ceased, the travellers stood there motionless and held their breath. The wind was whipping all around them, tossing dirt up from the ground in every direction as they cautiously glanced around, preparing for the end. As they remained still, thankfully, so did the sleeping monsters. While Felix had assumed they were light sleepers because of the way they slept with their eyes open, it appeared to be quite the opposite. When you were at the top of the food chain, he supposed they could afford to rest easy. Riley shot him an angry glance, and Felix looked away sheepishly. Gradually the group crept forward, until they finally came to another part of the wooden fence, with a small dugout section beneath it. Clarence motioned to Felix to crawl under once more. This time he was relieved to do as instructed. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows when Felix emerged on the other side. Beyond the fence on this side was a dark, sprawling woods. Although unlike Glowwood, visibility was low from the dense grey fog that blanketed this place in a veil. It was almost as if the smog from the outer reach had come down and settled in this place. The gnarled trees that they could see through the grey haze all appeared dead, and their barren branches reached up like skeleton hands before disappearing into it. Many of the trees were uprooted and fallen. It was almost like there had been a war here between them. The roots of fallen trees were snapped around those that were still standing and appeared to be strangling them, almost like the trees had killed each other off to survive on scarce resources. "What is this place?" Riley asked. Consumed by the grim sight of this ominous place, Felix didn't even notice his companions had made it under the fence. The neckroot tangle. The neckrootic. Neckrootic. I like that. Should play a necromantic ent called neckrootic. The neckrootic tangle, Clarence said. Should probably get going through before our friends back there wake up. For once, Felix agreed with him. They picked up the trail of the Blackwater River again and continued marching along, leaving the monster's lair behind them. Although Clarence had led them through unharmed, Felix still wasn't ready to trust him. As they progressed deeper into the necrotic tangle, the fog thickened immensely, and it became almost impossible to even see their own hands in front of their faces. Before they stopped to rest in this godforsaken place, Felix was eyeing Clarence warily. And that brings us to chapter 17, something about Clarence. I mean, there's been something wrong with Clarence since the start. So maybe we'll actually find out what is wrong with Clarence. Oh. Whoa, apologies that I'm struggling a little bit today. Like I said, I had a big day. I had a day with some physical exercise with this, swapping these desks out. So we'll do one more chapter and then I will call it a day. Because I am a little sleepy today, but that's okay. Book is good. Book is book. I like book. Let's carry on with book because there's something about Clarence and I need to know what. When the group finally did stop, they found a spot cloaked by a tangle of roots from one of the enormous fallen trees that provided a good shelter in the uninviting place where that's all one sentence. Damn, that's a long sentence. And I'm gonna have to start it again because I got distracted. When the group finally did stop, they found a spot cloaked by a tangle of roots from one of the enormous fallen trees that provided a good shelter in this uninviting place where life was seemingly non-existent. And there's not even a comma in there. There's no way to breathe in that sentence. No, we're not editing. Stop it. This is the problem when you, like, read books after you've been authoring for a while, and then you start, like, poking holes and things. And you're like, oh, that's not very good. No, the rest of this book has been great. There's some odd sentence structures sometimes, but it's been a good book. Peter, if you watch this, it's a good book. Please don't take any of that personally. They could tell that it was morning, but only because the heavy fog cover of the necrotic tangle was a little less grey, leaning more towards the ghostly hue of white. Riley slumped to the ground and began rubbing his wounded leg. "We should be safe here for the day," Clarence said. "We'll get moving again at dusk." "Sounds good to me," Riley said and rolled over. Before Felix even had the chance to sit down, Riley was fast asleep. The long journey, especially down a leg, was beginning to wear on him. Just before they'd stopped, Riley looked like he was about to keel over. There are merits and demerits of long sentences, definitely, but you should be able to read a sentence aloud and not run out of breath. And I think that's why a lot of authors and editors tend to recommend reading your stuff out loud, because it should flow well while you're reading it out loud. Books are meant to be read, and as much as your brain will not run out of breath, if it does, if I run out of breath reading it, then it's probably a bit too long. Though the merits of a nice long sentence probably helps build atmosphere more than a lot of short ones. Short sentences you would use to build for action scenes, like this happened, then this, and it tends to make the pacing go a bit quicker, whereas longer sentences like that will slow down your pacing a little bit and make it a bit more chill, and they're very good for basically what he did use it for there, which would be describing scenes, describing environments. Absolute skill issues, yeah. That's even when you're good at something, there's skill issues because you can never be perfect at something. Therefore, The kids are correct. Skill issues all around. I mean, we're reading my book next, so I get to be really mean at my own book because I'm the one who wrote it, so I can insult myself all I want. And it is a book I wrote like, what, 6 years ago? 5, 6 years ago now, so... No, a lot longer than that now, actually. It's approaching 10 years now. 8 years ago. Oh well, that'll be fun. That's future me's problem. Current me's problem is misperception. Shut up about the fanfic. Now the fanfic is probably closer to 20 years old, so that's terrible. And we still need to get to 1,000 subs for that, so that's not even a thing. It's not even a thing. Not unless I become super viral. Felix finally sat down next to Riley, using him as a buffer between himself and Clarence. When Felix glanced over at Clarence, the eerie cool wind that snuck through the tree roots was blowing his hair all over, but Felix was drawn to his eyes. When he looked at them, he could see Clarence's cold, empty eyes staring right back at him. Felix lay down next to Riley, who was far too asleep to tell him to back up this time. Rolling over so he wouldn't be facing Clarence, he went back to back with Riley. Still, he could feel Clarence's lifeless gaze boring into the back of his head. Felix couldn't close his eyes. He didn't even want to blink. For a few hours, Felix laid there, unable to sleep. Finally, Riley began to stir beside him, and then sat up. Oh, I just read the word yawned and it happens. Oh, that's what we do. Yawned and stretched himself out. He returned immediately to rubbing his leg again. Good morning, Clarence said cheerfully. Riley grumbled something inaudible and Clarence chuckled. Rolling over, Felix stretched himself out as well and feigned a yawn. He hadn't slept a wink, but he didn't want Clarence to know that. When he casually glanced over at Clarence, Felix could still see him staring back at him with his emotionless eyes, in the same position he'd been in hours before. He hadn't moved an inch. How did you sleep, Felix? Clarence asked. His words seemed filled with disdain. Pretty good, Felix replied as casually as he could. All of that excitement last night wiped me right out. Clarence nodded his head but didn't break his stare. Stop staring, it's weird. What was that place? Riley interrupted. Their lair, Clarence replied, finally shifting his attention away from Felix. Felix let out a sigh of relief. I figured as much, Riley said. Turning to Felix, he nudged him with his elbow. This guy, he started, motioning to Clarence. It doesn't surprise me that he'd go right through the monster's lair. He's always getting in all kinds of danger, but somehow always finds a way out of it. He once fought off a monster with nothing more than his bare hands. You flatter me, Clarence said. Anyway, Felix, are we sure we haven't met before? Where did you say you were from again? I didn't, Felix answered coldly. The last thing he wanted to do was give away too much information to someone untrustworthy. He learned that lesson the hard way. Felix was a prisoner of the others, Riley interjected, but he escaped. Felix shot him a glance, but Riley was still working on his leg. Clarence seemed surprised by the revelation. You escaped from the others? He cried. Why would you attempt something so reckless? And how did you even manage to do it? Felix met his stare fiercely. He wanted to make sure Clarence knew that he wasn't someone that could be easily messed with. After all, he had stood up to the monsters, Nikolai, and even the tormentors. I bit one of them, Felix said scornfully. You bit one of them? Clarence repeated. Felix couldn't tell if he was shocked or impressed. What would possess you to do such a thing? They brought me to the bad place, Felix said, and they tormented me. They would have eaten me if I had given them the chance. It was the only way I could escape. Eaten you? Clarence repeated, almost in a mocking tone. The others don't eat our kind. Riley had strangely been peddling the same misinformation, but Felix was certain that that was what they had always intended on doing to him. Surely they fed you while you were in captivity, Clarence began. So, Felix interrupted, their food wasn't worth what they put me through. Haven't you heard the expression, don't bite the hand that feeds you? Bite the hand that feeds you. Bite the hand that feeds you. Felix hadn't. Speaking of escape stories, Riley interrupted, let's hear it, Clarence. How did you manage to get away? Keeping his gaze curiously fixed on Felix for just another moment, Clarence finally broke off his stare. I guess I've kept you in suspense long enough, he said. It really wasn't difficult. I mean, once you've fought off a monster, everything else is cake. He patted his large belly. I'm sure you know all about cake, Riley jested. But how did you do it? I'm dying for details. His eyes were filled with wonder and an admiration, which made Felix dislike Clarence even more. It wasn't that he didn't have to try for Relix and It wasn't that he didn't have to try for Riley's endearment, but maybe Felix was just jealous about the whole situation. He realized as Clarence stood up and recanted his story. I just called out to it. Take me one-on-one if you're man enough. Pointing in the direction of a phantom enemy, he pounded against his chest with his fist indignantly. Once I had his attention, he continued, it was easy enough to dispatch of it in hand-to-hand combat. He let off a few punches and kicks in the air, moving with such inelegance. Felix wondered how Clarence would have dispatched any opponent that wasn't on the dessert menu. You defeated a metal arm in hand-to-hand combat! Riley cried. It took a moment for the words to register, but as soon as they did, Felix whirled his head around to face him. Did you just say metal arm? He stammered. Yeah, Riley said. The last time I saw this guy, he'd been taken by the metal arm, and here he is, in the flesh. All at once, Felix knew what was behind the cold, lifeless stares that Clarence had been giving him. It was nothing at all. Clarence was lying about defeating the metal arm in combat. He'd done no such thing. In fact, Felix now knew exactly what had happened. Clarence had been taken away by the metal arm, and Felix knew exactly where he had been taken. The bad place. Riley said he'd lost a lot of friends to the metal arm. Clarence must have been one of them. Most of them, Riley said, hadn't returned, and he presumed they were dead. The ones that had returned were all husks of their former selves. They'd all been changed. As Felix stared into Clarence's cold, dead eyes, he knew that Clarence had met the same fate. His heart leaping into his throat, Felix jumped to his feet. What the heck's gotten into you? Felix couldn't speak. He could only stare at the husk of Clarence that sat before them and was staring back intently at him. Yes, Felix, he said. Whatever seems to be the matter? Felix glanced over at Riley. His eyes were screaming towards him, but Riley still wasn't getting the message. What happened? Riley repeated. I thought I heard a noise or something. Felix lied, not very convincingly. Through clenched teeth, he was whispering the words changed over and over again, trying to motion towards Clarence with his eyes. Riley stared at him curiously for a moment before looking away. I didn't hear anything, he said, and went right back to rubbing his leg. Oh, but Riley! Poor baby. He doesn't want to believe his friend's changed. Oh, no. Clarence stared at Felix as he slowly sat back down. "Are you sure you're okay, little Felix?" he asked. "You seem worried about something." Fuck off. Using the same lines he's used on you, you sussy bastard. His tone was calm and robotic, incredibly hollow and void of any emotion, just like his eyes, which made everything he said come off as terribly threatening. Felix was kicking himself for not realizing it sooner. If what he thought he knew was true, then Clarence couldn't be trusted. Who knew what he had in store for them? Yet Riley seemed completely oblivious to the obvious signs in front of him. His history with Clarence was blinding him. "He's always a little spastic." Bad word, bad word. Riley answered for Felix. Felix didn't even care about the dig. He was consumed by the revelation. "So," Felix began nervously, his voice trembling, but he needed Riley to see through his charade. "You managed to escape from it?" "That's what I said," Clarence responded. "It seems pretty unbelievable," Felix tried. "Don't you think, Riley?" "Unbelievable is right," Riley said. "Incredible, really." That definitely wasn't what Felix meant. "Hey, Clarence," Riley continued. "What do you think about wrangling up some food in this barren wasteland?" The chances of finding food in the narcotic tangle seemed slim to none, but Felix lit up at the idea because he saw this as his chance. If he could just get Riley alone, he could tell him everything he discovered about Clarence. Then they would be able to flee from him together, before he was able to enact his dastardly plan, whatever it was. "Oh no," Clarence said. "I couldn't leave you like this. Why don't we send little Felix out there?" Again, Felix felt like Clarence was offering him up to be sacrificed. Riley chuckled. "You haven't seen Felix, Hunt," he said. "He's completely worthless." "Hey!" Felix cried. Although he realized Riley was right, and more importantly, that his worthlessness could actually play to his advantage, obviously Riley wouldn't be able to find food in his current state, and Felix was absolutely helpless on that front. That left only Clarence. "I mean," Felix backtracked, "yeah, I've never hunted anything in my life, and I'm completely worthless." "Oh no, I'm still baby. Please baby me now." Riley shook his head. "You're so weird," he mumbled. "What do you say, Clarence? I'm starving over here." Clarence agreed, albeit reluctantly, and Felix wondered if Clarence had only done so to not make Riley suspicious of him. Either way, Felix was incredibly suspicious, and he was about to let Riley in on the whole thing, although Riley's not going to believe a word you say. Rising from the ground, Clarence smiled at both of them before leaving. "You two sit tight," he said. "I'll be right back." His promise felt more like a threat than anything else. Clarence's smile lingered on Felix for a moment, as if to say, You've won this round." Just before Clarence turned away, his smile faded to a frighteningly blank expression. When Felix was certain he was gone and out of earshot, he turned to Riley. "Clarence has changed, Riley," he began in a frantic whisper. "We've got to get out of here." Riley chortled. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "I'm talking about Clarence," Felix cried out. He quickly composed himself and lowered his voice back to a whisper. "He's changed." "Changed from what?" Riley asked. "From the way he used to be," Felix pleaded. "How would you know that?" Riley asked. "He's still the same old Clarence to me. A little heavier, sure, but—" "Riley!" Felix interrupted. "The metal arm! He defeated it in hand-to-hand combat," Riley said. "You heard it yourself." Felix stared back at Riley in disbelief. He wouldn't even consider what Riley was saying. "Listen," Riley began. "I've seen Clarence fight off a monster before. It's not that hard to believe that he could fight off a metal arm." "You've really seen him fight off a monster?" "Felix," Riley continued. Would I lie to you? Everyone knows you fought off that monster. But did you see it? Felix begged. That doesn't matter. Riley! Felix pleaded. He led us right into a trap last night. Are you talking about the monster's lair? Because if you are, he led us out of the monster's lair, Felix. Maybe you're forgetting that part. But he also led us into the monster's lair, Riley, Felix cried. Or did you forget that part? You're being paranoid, Riley said dismissively. Felix couldn't believe he was brushing him off. But maybe he had a point. Clarence had led them out of the monster's lair unscathed, but Felix still wasn't convinced. He would have felt better if they'd just left Clarence behind and never saw him again. But Riley remained steadfast in his decision, and Felix couldn't well leave him. It wasn't even because he needed Riley anymore, although he still did. It was because, in his current condition, Riley also needed him. I don't trust him, Felix said flatly. Riley looked back at him. Do you trust me? He asked. Felix didn't really need to think about it, because Riley had become the only thing he could trust in this cruel world that he'd never known. He felt guilty for thinking, even for a moment back there in the monster's lair, that Riley could ever betray him. Because I trust him, Riley continued. So trust me. Nothing bad is going to happen to us. Us? Felix repeated. What happened to leaving me behind if I'm slowing you down? Tears were beginning to well in his eyes. Riley's eyes met his, and for a moment, Felix could sense a deep sadness behind them. But Riley quickly looked away. At that moment, Clarence returned, thwarting any hopes of escape behind him easily. Felix still couldn't shake the feeling that he was up to something, but he couldn't possibly fathom what it was. What are you boys talking about? He asked, glaring directly at Felix. Felix looked at his wounded friend. Nothing important, Riley answered for them both. Did you find anything? Clarence shook his head. I couldn't find any food, he said, but it was scouting out our locale, and we're almost there. Riley shot up. The Promised Land, he cried enthusiastically. Clarence nodded his head. We're really close, he said. If we go now, we can be there before nightfall. Then what are we waiting for? Oh, good lord. Oh, good lord. Clarence lying out of his ass. Poor Riley. The news had given him a second wind, breathing new life into him. If he was being honest, when the monster had taken a chunk out of his leg, Riley was beginning to lose hope, although he was never going to let Felix know that at the time. Then, when Clarence came, he was their salvation, and now all of their efforts were finally about to pay off. Giddy with excitement, Riley marched towards the opening in the fallen tree roots, but he didn't get very far, as Felix suddenly grabbed him by the arm and yanked him backwards. Riley glanced back at him, obviously irritated. What are you doing? He snapped. It's daytime, Felix reminded him. I thought we agreed it wasn't safe to travel during the day. It'll be easier to find during the day, Clarence assured them. Riley brushed Felix off. You heard the man, he said. Let's go. Wait, Riley, wasn't that one of your ground rules? Yeah. And the other ground rule was that I can change the ground rules whenever I want, Riley answered, growing increasingly impatient with Felix. Clarence led the way, and Riley left the safety of the roots, leaving a troubled Felix behind. Felix had no choice but to follow. And that was the end of that chapter. They're going to some sus place. Salvation. I can't help but think that salvation is what Clarence currently thinks salvation is. And that it will not be good for anyone. It will be much yabai. That was a long chapter. It always is. As soon as I say, I'll do one last chapter, it's suddenly a very long chapter. Tis the way. Tis the way. But it's okay, because I'm still 5 minutes under 2 hours, so at least it hasn't taken me over 2 hours. But that'll be me for this stream. I apologise that I tripped over myself a few more times than usual, because I had a bit of a day. I'm a wee bit more sleepy than usual today. I will be back on Tuesday, and we will finish off the murder of Sonic the Hedgehog. Yeah, Clarence. It's either Clarence is being remotely operated in some capacity, or maybe he does have his own sussy reasons. And I can't wait to find out exactly what Felix's memories stuff is about. Like, I thought maybe that it would be weird that, like, Nikolai's his dad or some stuff like that, and that, like, his mum had to go abandon him because Nikolai would do bad things. I don't know. I'm very curious to find out what exactly that is. We have 30% of this book left. Or maybe he is the Clarence, the killer of the metal arm. Or maybe he is just that tough. Maybe he just rolled on the metal arm and his, like, gigantic jiggliness just rolled him over. Big round trash panda wrecking ball. But yes, I will be back on Tuesday with probably the last part of the murder of Sonic the Hedgehog. Yes, the power of Chunk. And then I'll be back on Sunday with more Misperception. I'm not guaranteeing. Again, this is all up in the air because it depends on what I feel like doing that day. But I am off on Wednesday, and I might stream, but it depends. I might want to just not talk to anyone that day, or I might get lonely and want to stream. We'll find out on the day. So there is a chance of a gorilla that day. And if I do a gorilla, I'll probably do some Final Fantasy. Other than that, I don't think there's anything else. I hope you enjoyed the stream. Thank you, Q, in the chat. Thank you to anyone who lurked. Thank you to anyone who watches the VOD. This has been... I had fun. I hope you had fun. This has been Brandon Ross Smith live from the Forbidden Library.